This is a major worldwide discovery that is pretty much unknown. The head of archaeology in the world, he claims that we'll never know what Bronze Age people were thinking because they had no written language. That's a bronze axe with, you can see, markings all over it. Experts say that these have artwork on them, but I found that I could count the artwork. They recorded what they thought in numbers, and I've been able to interpret what they're talking about. So basically, late prehistory is not unknown anymore.
I'm absolutely fascinated by how you've been able to somewhat go into the past, learn another language from another time, and be able to interpret it.
Are you ready for one more little discovery?
Yeah.
It's come to light how Americans' view of their continent and who's been living here before has been affected by disinformation.
What sort of disinformation is that?
That's called Columbus was first.
So Columbus was not first.
He was the last. It's political disinformation. He was certainly not the first. I certainly found a lot of evidence that he's not. So why are the Spanish want to prove that Columbus was first?
Jay, welcome to the Ginny Show. I interview lots of interesting people in my show and in my lifetime. What I find particularly interesting about you, and this was the first question that came up when I read all up about you, how does a zoologist end up talking about archaeology?
Well, they say most people that go to the university don't do what they've studied. Most people.
So how did you go from animals to buildings?
Actually, I did go to buildings. I was president of a contracting company for a while. We'd build apartment buildings and stuff. Remodeled old apartment buildings stuff. But archaeology has always been my hobby, and it started in 1976, which now is 48 years ago, almost 49 years ago. We were asked by a family member to go back to, we live in Seattle, suburbs of Seattle, and we were asked to go to a family do back on the Hudson to watch the centennial, all the old ships come into New York Harbor. And Aunt Ruth had booked everybody into the Algonquin Hotel. And then it turned out my wife came over and said, well, we're not allowed to stay because we're only fiancé. We're not married. We got married in 77, so the hotel wouldn't take us. So then Aunt Ruth went over and straightened out the hotel. She was a power person. And the next thing you knew, we were in a hotel and everything was fine. Anyway, everything started in 76. Then, because my dad had asked me to read Barry Fell's book, and he was a Harvard professor who was also in biology, but his South Seashell biology research had led him into American Bronze Age, which was a bit of a trip, but that's what happened to me too. And I read his book, and it had a picture of a place on a mountaintop in Pomfret, Vermont, which was across the river from Dartmouth, where I'd gone to school. And so we went up from the 1976 Hudson thing. We went up, drove up to the college and went to the little reunion that they had, and then crossed the river and climbed this little mountain to see what in the world Barry Fell had in his book. And I went up on the top, and there it was. The very thing that was in the book, pictured in the book, was on top of this little hill. You could just put a garbage bag on and walk up through the rain to the top of the hills, and there we were. And that's 48 years ago. And so I've been studying this ever since. And a number of what I would focus on is some of the amazing discoveries that have occurred during this time in my experience.
What are some of those discoveries that have occurred? In particular, those discoveries that are of interest to you?
Well, I think they'll be interesting to everyone. The head of archaeology in the world maybe is a guy named Barry Cunliffe. This is my age, looks like me, everything's my age, 81 years old. He's the head of archaeology at Oxford, and he's got a book out which is quite magnificent, inch and a half thick in color. And he claims in the book that we'll never know what Bronze Age people were thinking because they had no written language. Sound was in the air, and it couldn't. There was no conception it's only a little while ago, a few thousand years ago, people didn't understand how to write. Okay. So he says, we'll never know what they were thinking or what they were doing in his book. And that's the world's expert. Now, what's come to light is that they wrote down their thoughts, not in writing, but in numbers, because they could count. They were smart people, and they could count. Okay, so that Dr. Moog in Germany collected from the antiquarians who had collected these things from passage graves and stuff. In Europe, he had bought from the antiquarians bronze axes that had what they were called decorated. And the experts say that these have artwork on them. But I found that I could count the artwork. It's amazing. They recorded what they thought in numbers. And here's an example. I'll just show one. This is what I'm talking about. That's a bronze axe with, you can see, markings all over it. Okay, so I have 35 of those, which I had to buy from this fellow. And most of them are in my book. This is my new book, Colonies, on the backside. Has a bunch of these on the cover of it, okay? So I have been able to count on almost all of them, and I've been able to interpret what they're talking about. Because they've recorded in latitudes where they were going, where they were sailing, and where their colonies were. It's just remarkable that I've been able to decipher what is essentially late Bronze Age or late prehistory through the numeric encodings in bronze. Now, maybe they wrote on other stuff. Maybe they used numbers other ways. I have no idea why they put this stuff on the bronze, on these bronze axes. I don't know. I just know that they have survived, and I had to, bid for these things. They're about $1,200 a piece. I got about 35 of them. Wow. And some of these axes were very clear. One of the better ones was this one. These are islands that are down off the coast of Africa, and anyway, I guess it doesn't come across through real well, but the islands Bolavento and the island Solavento, it's just very clear what they're talking about. They're sailing, and there's 6 islands, and they're sailing right in between them and so on. So basically, late prehistory is not unknown anymore because I've got the stuff, and nobody knows what it is except me. And it's in my book. So this is a major worldwide discovery. Now, that is pretty much unknown to anyone. Here's one that has the sun god in gold.
So that's carved into the axe.
There you go. That's carved right. The gold is pounded into the axe. Gold. Okay. And then here is a feather dancer.
Wow.
Carved into the bronze. We know and I know where they were dancing.
So this is the really interesting part, Jay, that I'm going to just stop you there on. You've shown us these beautiful pieces of art from history that communicate something which you have been able to completely decode. I want to kind of take it.
No, not completely.
But mostly decode.
I can read important stuff often. I can't read all of it.
Yep.
I think as it gets more study over time that we'll learn more from these.
Well, as someone who struggles to just sometimes read English fluently, I'm absolutely fascinated by how you've been able to somewhat go into the past, learn another language from another time, and be able to interpret it, which is what I find fascinating about your work. So can we kind of go back a few steps? You've shown us these amazing axes and the stories or the information that's conveyed in them. Can you talk me through how you actually got to that interpretation or translation?
Okay, the first axe I bought had some niches down the side. It's one of them in the book here. And I counted the niches, and there were 20. I'm just on the internet, I see this thing. And I could see the niches, and I could count there were 23.
Right.
And on the other side, there were 23. And then it's a kind of a box-shaped axe, right? And there's 4 edges. Every edge had 23 niches. Now, archaeologists would have you believe that happens by accident, because they call them plow marks and stuff. But no. I know what 23 was. 23 is the latitude of that the sun rises to over Europe or around the world. It runs up to 23 and then goes south again. The sun goes south again. It changes from fall to winter. That's as far north as the sun comes on the surface of the earth. And they knew it. And it's on the dang axis because it turns out that it's in a lot of the European monuments also. It's a very important number in the sun religion, which was big in Egypt at the time. So we have here information from late prehistory that we didn't have before. And that is a major discovery. And it's all in my latest book. I think it's a remarkable thing. Now, there have been some other remarkable discoveries too. In the process of traveling a lot of places, which I've done, all down the coast of Europe and a fair amount around the world, we were in a rock shelter in Harmony, Maine. Okay, looking at the petroglyphs carved in the stones in this place. We were led there by some friends that suggested we should go there. I took pictures of a bunch of petroglyphs, with letters and dots and things. I didn't know what they were, but nobody knew they were there. So I took them and I put the pictures into my first book, and so on. And I just did the book because all this stuff was accumulated. And I thought, geez, this is important stuff. I should record it. So we did a first book called The Sun God, and it's all about the petroglyphs in Europe. But also some stuff in Maine is in there. And here are these petroglyphs in Maine, and the letters have these dots in between them. So I'm speaking at a conference about 20 or 30 years later. Mind you, I can only count to 100. It's not hard studying this stuff. My friend that reads 5 languages, he stands up and he says, I know what that is. That is Veneti. That is the language of the Celts on the coast of Europe that were defeated at sea by the Romans. They built a fleet and killed most of them. Some of them escaped and came to America and so on. But at any rate, he's writing a book on the discovery of Veneti language in Maine. It is the first time ever that Celts and specific Celtic tribe has been identified in the United States. I mean, Barry Fell wrote it in 1976 that there were Celts, and I told you I went up on the little mountain near Dartmouth, and there was a Celtic rock shelter, as described by Barry Fell in his book America BC, which everyone ought to read. It's the keystone book of this whole thing. But he didn't have any idea what Celts they were. But now, because of the rock shelter in Harmony, Maine, we know that those Celts were of the Veneti. I'm maybe not pronouncing it the way some other people would. You could say Veneti or Veneti. At any rate, my friend Lon Krieger is writing a book now based on this. He went to the rock shelter and studied all that. So we have a new discovery of language in prehistory on bronze. And we have a new discovery of the Veneti language in America. Stuff comes up all the time. Now, here's another one that just happened that's a new discovery. That is an earth-shaking, should be, shake-up archaeology. A friend just went to, said, where should she travel? I said, well, Crete's a fun place to travel. You drive on the right side of the road. It's beautiful. The food's good. You know, it's safe to drive. Unlike Malta, it's a good place to go. So she went and she took pictures in the new Archaeological Museum in Heraklion, which is the capital of Crete. And because they looked funny, the museum ladies, who I've talked to before on another subject, they put oxide ingots right in the front of the case that had patterns on the back of them that they didn't understand. So they picked out these 2 ingots. Now, do I have a copy? I don't have them right here. So here's the deal. I look right at them. I can see what it is. They are papaguli. Papaguli are the seed pods of mangroves. And when you're in the Bahamas, which I've spent a year down in the Bahamas, whatever, and, when I was a kid, it's in Florida, these seed pods are all over the beaches. You see them all over the place because they drift all over. And wherever they drift in a little shallow place where there's not any wind, it grows a new mangrove tree. All right. So to get these seed pods on the ground, you got to be close to the water. Tide's got to go up and down and so on. So these 60-pound ingots of copper that are in the museum in Crete. Archaeology all wonders, where does the copper come from? They're looking in the Caucasus. They really don't know. They say it came from Europe, Mediterranean, but it didn't. Most of the copper in the world is smelted. But in Michigan, it was pure copper crystallized in a lava bed. Okay? And that stuff was taken by boat down the Mississippi to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And they melted it there. They had logs coming down the Pearl River and the Mississippi, which pretty much mouths are the same place. And at that time, and Bruce Seth, the archaeologist, did a big study there. And there's carbon, piles of carbon that are 6 feet deep, running the length of football fields, because they were melting all this Michigan copper. 10,000 pits where they were mining copper in Michigan. They don't know where the copper went in Michigan. And in Europe, they don't know where the copper came from in the Bronze Age. But it was brought down to the Gulf of Mexico, melted into little pots in the ground, little molds, and shipped to Europe, okay? And that whole deal, we're trying to prove it based on the contents of the copper and so on, which is extremely pure. So 99% pure because it was crystallized in the copper bed. So when you look at the Uluburun shipwreck over there, where they got 300 or 400 of these copper ingots, yeah, they test out to be Michigan copper. They're absolutely pure. They're not smelted. And when they're carrying them around on the temple walls, and, a gift to the pharaoh or something, they're carrying around these copper ingots. Well, how do we know? How do we know they were built on the Gulf Coast? It's because 2 of them in the museum in Crete have papaguli seed pods in the back. The seed pods got into the mold when they melted the copper and poured it on the beach. They poured it into these clay molds. And what the archaeologists found, Bruce Seth, who's my age, another guy's probably retired, he says, well, it was really weird. We were down through all this carbon, 6 feet of carbon in these little villages down on the Gulf Coast. What else did he find? He found hunks and hunks and hunks of hot, clay that had been heated, but was all broken into fragments. And stone axes. Why? What did he didn't know what he was looking at. What he found, he picked up a copper that had been cooled in these molds on the ground in multiple pourings. The Hauptmann Group in Germany determined that this copper was made in, because it was Spratzen, it broke real easily. They called it Spratzen. So that it was made over wooden fires over in a very moist environment because it was full of bubbles, made it crackle, break easily because they called it Spratzen. Anyway, what they do is they wait for the copper to cool, then take stone axes and break the clay off the back. And so there was all these hardened clay pieces, and they couldn't figure out what they were making. Well, they weren't making anything. What they were making was, this was the back mold for the copper ingots, which was a copper trade to Europe, and for 1,000 years, copper was shipped to Europe by sea, which archaeology denies that ever could have happened or did happen. But we have plenty of other evidence that it did happen. And this is the best evidence I have ever seen, is papaguli in the back of an ingot in Crete. I mean, you have to have made it where mangroves were. Couldn't have been made any other way. I've presented 3 really earth-shaking discoveries here. One, that copper ingots in Crete were manufactured where papaguli got into the mold. Two, that copper axes are readable numerically. Are you ready for one more little discovery?
Yeah, I am ready. And then I do have a follow-up question, but I'll let you go first.
It's these things. They look this thing here. It's an artifact. And Indians wear these things. They call them banner stones, whatever. Okay, so you can put a string on each side. But this one has, how can I show you? Across the top here, there are 3 triangles, 4.5 triangles, and columns. Can you see the columns? There are columns on this darn thing. That was found in New Jersey.
The columns are found in New Jersey, or that particular piece of
this artifact with the columns on it,
yeah,
and the triangles was found in New Jersey. Yeah.
Huh.
That's a world-class discovery. We found 2 of those actually.
Okay.
Because most of those are found in Portugal. They have the ocean carved on them, whatever. They're hero pendants in passage graves in Europe. They're found all over the place. I bought some from a guy who was picking them up out of passage graves. All right, so, but you go to Portugal and you see them on restaurant menus and in hotels and museums and all over the place. These are found in the graves in Portugal. If some guy was brave enough or silly enough to sail across the ocean, which took a month, and a year-long voyage to go over there and back, if a guy is hero enough to do that, he's hero enough to have a badge in his grave showing the sun god that he was a hero for transatlantic sailing. So they're common in Portugal. No big deal, all right? They don't know what they are, but they, there's a professor in the Midwest who made a career out of studying these things and doesn't quite get it. But at any rate, they're not found in the United States. But we found several in the United States. And not only do they have the correct width of the Atlantic Ocean on them, which the others do also, the triangles, but it also has columns. Some guy had been to Egypt. Where else are you going to see? The Greek culture hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So somebody's been to Egypt. They got to New Jersey with this pendant. It's an amazing, I suppose, technically, they call it a new part. It's an out-of-place artifact. And the way archaeologists handle this kind of thing is they say, well, they were dropped there by somebody. Then, of course, that's the argument they use on Roman coins. There's been bags full of Roman coins found, buried all up and down the Ohio River. And, of course, the bags are rotting away, and here's just coins in the dirt. But there's been a lot of those found, dozens of sites, all right? So archaeologists say, well, yeah, but coin collectors dropped them there, buried them there. Some guy collected them, buried them in his backyard. It's obvious. But what's interesting is that no coin collector has ever buried or lost any coins west of the Rockies. Only in the Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley. So it's been fun, hasn't it, to study this subject, because things come along, and usually when interesting things come along like this, they back up what we're doing somehow or other. We're on the right track, because almost always, if a very unusual ingot comes up with a papaguli on it, it's something that's important and makes a big contribution to what we know. We haven't been threatened by a lot of stuff that says we're wrong. Okay? So, but it's fun because these are new things that people have no conception what's going on. I have a whole conception of early America that nobody knows. I mean, I'm running around with a head that's infected with all these people that were running around America. There was a colony in Illinois. We've got a lot of artifacts that were stolen out of there. I bought some of them from the guy, their stolen product.
So the first thing that you said was, archaeologists kind of find these things, and it's, in a way, it reminds me of detective work, right? You have to go back in time, find these objects, and figure out sometimes, one, what the objects are, how they got there, and then prove that that is the case. You have to kind of build that evidence. But the other thing that I find interesting about what you shared, you've made these pretty amazing discoveries about what you've found, and you've been able to translate certain things and the meanings of things. I'm going to ask you a broader question, and this is very off the cuff. Do you think the way history is evaluated nowadays with modern technology and the attention spans of youth, do you think history is valued in the same way it was 20 years ago?
I find people are very interested in this subject, actually. Yeah.
You do?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And one of the things that, of course, that came to light that I've come to understand is how disinformation has affected our understanding of history. And we're certainly very, I mean, the internet has been described by some people, maybe me too, as a cesspool because it is so loaded with disinformation. And so I don't do any of that. I don't even know what's up and WhatsApp and what these various things are. I don't even know. I don't care. I've got my own interests, and I don't delve in the in this internet world very much. I use internet a lot for research. There's no question. And I mean, my work wouldn't have been possible if I couldn't work with my partner in Holland. Putting text back and forth across the world. You know, it's the net has made this research possible, just like it's made a lot of other people's research possible. I mean, the whole civilization is advancing forward pretty fast because of the computers and the internet and the whole thing. But you got to be careful. And it's come to light how Americans' view of their continent and who's been living here before has been affected by disinformation.
What sort of disinformation is that? Can you expand on that?
That's called Columbus was first.
So Columbus was not first.
He was the last. 1497 is, 1,500 years after zero, right? My research is Bronze Age, which is 3,000 or 4,000 BC. So 5,000 years before Columbus is what I'm talking about. So why are the Spanish want to prove that Columbus was first? I mean, he was last. He was nobody. And then all of a sudden they picked him out. They said that he was picked out because, and built up into this big story because they want to be the good guys that Christianized America and brought Jesus to the continent and all that. They wanted to be first. It's political disinformation. He was certainly not the first. I certainly found a lot of evidence that he's not.
What sort of evidence have you found that he's not?
How about Papaguli in Egypt or Papaguli in Crete? You know, just throw one out there. We have whole harbors where a lot of ships. I've been amazed at, as I've pursued this, how many ships were sailing the Atlantic for how long? I mean, thousands of years, hundreds of ships. We found harbors on Beaver Island up in Lake Michigan. We got harbors over at the Huron Mountain Club. We got in Lake Superior. We got a lot of. One of the gals who does research with us, Joan Conover, she's been a DARPA, Defense Project Research Agency researcher, and she has identified hundreds of mooring slips on salt domes off in New Orleans on the Gulf Coast, where they've been cut square, and obviously it's been mooring areas for boats, and very little archaeology has been done down there. It's underwater now a little bit, but effigy. They found an effigy carved and a pottery factory on one of these submerged salt domes. The hardest thing for people in this whole subject is time, because we live only 80 years or more, a little more, I hope. So, but I'm talking about timescales of thousands of years here, and people don't understand. For example, thousands of people are visiting Stonehenge all the time. I mean, they're driving up in these buses and they're paying $20 a piece. Archaeology in Britain is making $1 million. when I went there 30 years ago or so, they were making $100 million a year off of the tourists at Stonehenge. And they have covered up the old parts of the thing, and tourists go there to see the big rocks in the middle. Mm-hmm. But archaeology has determined that Stonehenge 1, which did not have the big stones in it, was built at 3000 BC.
Wow.
If you take from the station stone, which is now covered up with a boardwalk, but if it used to be a station stone there, and you draw lines out to all the stones in the entry of Stonehenge, and you look at the angles that they had, I mean, I'm telling you that these people were mathematically smart, astronomically, and they could read angles, and they knew that those stones were all at the angles of the latitudes of the islands in the North Atlantic where they were sailing. It's very clear that they were sailing all those places and that they recorded them in Stonehenge 1. Okay?
Wow.
Stonehenge 2, no big deal. Blue stones, whatever, forget them, they're little. Mm-hmm. Stonehenge 3 is those big rocks. And they say that was built at 2000 BC. Now that's at 1,000 years later. Okay? So why are they coming back to a site 1,000 years later and going to the work to add all those big rocks? We believe from our studies, which are in my first book, that Renaud de Jong is my partner, figured a lot of it out. He's a Dutch a mathematician. They had found something on the other side of the world. They'd been looking for 1,000 years. They had recorded all the places they went over to Greenland and across. They found the other side of the world, and they were so excited. 1,000 years later, they found the place. They were stopped for 800 years at the south end of Greenland because that's the biggest temperature difference in the world. All the icebergs come down off of Greenland in the Labrador Current, and the Gulf Stream comes up from the Caribbean, and it's 80 degrees, and the 80 degrees water hits the icebergs, and they were frightened to death. And for 800 years, they were scared to go through the fog in those big icebergs. They thought it was God. That was something else. So they didn't cross it for a long time. But we know when they crossed, they knew that they took a shortcut because the Lac-Gachar monument explains it, which they think is a destroyed monument, but it's not as beautiful, explains the shortcut they cut. All right, but at any rate, that's in the books. But at any rate, Stonehenge 3 was built because they found something on the other side of the world, and they were excited about it, and they were getting rich on it. They brought in all these pearls and copper and furs and stuff and drugs, which showed up in the Egyptian mummies, right? Cocaine. It only comes from America, and they find it in Egyptian mummies. All right, so all these facts fit together, right? And so they found all this stuff. They found a whole other side of the world, and they built a monument for it. So what is it? What is the big rock? What are the big rocks people look at? They have no idea. Do you know?
Right. No, I don't.
It's a monument to the discovery of America. And what all these people got in their heads? That Columbus found America at 1500 AD, 1497 AD, right? And the Columbus and the ocean blue. That's all baloney, right? Because they built these big rocks at Stonehenge in 2000 BC. That is what? 3,500 years earlier than Columbus. They built the monument for the discovery of America. Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Wow.
So anyway, I've got a whole different conception of what was existing on this continent. There were people here collecting copper, shipping it to Europe, giving Europe a Bronze Age. It's amazing what happened in the New World. And now the Bronze Age, what happened to the Bronze Age? It ended 1500 BC. A comet came in and blew everything up. And all the copper mining ceased overnight. Atlantis, which was trading copper on Atlantis seamount off of near the Canaries, and it fell in the ocean, knocked in the ocean by volcanism of this. There was worldwide volcanism, and the whole world got set back, and the world didn't recover until the Greeks come along, around 600 AD or so. The world took quite a long time to come out of that dark period. But all the world's religions came out of it too, because
Interesting.
the sky had all this swirling stuff in it, and the Greeks say, "Oh, Zeus was formed in the sky when the reds and the purples and the everything." Yeah, well, it did. There was a major cataclysm, and most of the people in the world died. And a big cataclysm at 1197 BC, and the 50 years or 100 years after that, as this stuff continued to come down. They say we see a little bit of it in the fall today, and call it Enki.
Thank you for that, Jay. That was very, very insightful. I've certainly been shown a different way of thinking when it comes to these things. So we've come to the end of our hour together, and I really want to thank you for your time, Jay. Where can the good people of the Ginny Show find your latest book?
Amazon has them. And if you're a Kindle person, which I'm not yet, they're free. The latest one is one of the free books you can sign up for a Kindle. The other ones, you can get hardbacks. They're charging a lot of money for them.
Yeah. Okay.
I've helped them do it. You just go under J. Stuart Wakefield, and they're all listed there.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure we'll include a link to that in our show notes so people can go and learn about archaeology. Jay, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting learning everything from you.
I learn from other people when they call or I talk to them.
Yeah, you do?
So my email's in my book. Anybody can email me.
Oh, fantastic. What's the best email people can get you on?
Letters for J. Stewart, it's just JS Wakefield at Comcast.
Perfect. So there you go, guys. You can email Jay at
You can.
JS
I have
Wakefield
to
at
shut it
Comcast.
off if there's too much, but it's never happened to me yet. Most
Fantastic.
people will call or have an interesting question,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jay. It's been a pleasure having you on The Ginny Show.
Jenny, thank you very much.